When she is remembered at all today, USS Trenton is thought of as an old wooden ship which was destroyed by the hurricane at Samoa in 1889, while HMS Calliope, with her steel hull and powerful engines, escaped into the open sea. While she indeed had a wooden hull, USS Trenton was the only ship newly commissioned into the U.S. Navy in the 1870s, which even approached the size, capability, and power of the cruisers of major nations. She was the pride of the fleet, and an innovative vessel which introduced a number of technologies to the U.S. Navy, including compound engines, internal iron bulkheads, a uniform battery of a new type of rifled gun, electrical firing of that battery from a central position, and, a few years after commissioning, electric lighting throughout the ship. Trenton pointed the way to the U.S. Navy's first steel cruisers of the 1880s, and in 1889, when a crisis with the German Empire started brewing over Samoa, those steel cruisers were newly commissioned and still working up in the Atlantic. USS Trenton, the flagship of the Pacific Squadron and the pride of the fleet, was sent to underline American resolve. The period between the end of the Civil War and the new Navy of the late 1880s is called the Dark Ages of the U.S. Navy. By 1865, the U.S. Navy was massive, but it had been built to blockade the southern coast, fight forts and ironclads in coastal waters, control the rivers, and chase down commerce raiders on the high seas. None of the ships built for these specific purposes were particularly good at the peacetime mission of representing the United States in ports of call around the world. The ironclad monitors couldn't operate in anything but a flat calm. They were laid up or placed on harbor defense duties. Too many of the wooden-hulled ships, which were rapidly built during the war, went out of service almost as rapidly in the late 1860s as their white oak hulls rotted away. And so at the dawn of the 1870s, the U.S. Navy relied far too heavily on ships built in the years just before the Civil War. Wabash, Hartford, Richmond, Kearsarge, and the like had stout live oak hulls and famous war records, but their machinery was tired, and their armament consisted of Dahlgren shell guns designed for the 1850s. In February of 1873, Congress approved the construction of 8 new ships for the U.S. Navy. 7 of these would be gunboats, small ships suitable for peacetime cruising, although notably 3 of the gunboats were to be iron-hulled ships of the Alert class. The 8th was Trenton. At 3,900 tons, she was 3 times the displacement of any of the gunboats. Whereas the smaller ships carried a single heavy pivot gun, Trenton carried 11 such guns. The gun in question was the 8-inch muzzle-loading rifle. The 8-inch, also known as a 180-pounder, was a conversion of the 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore. Beginning in 1876, some 11-inch Dahlgrens, which had been manufactured during the Civil War but had never seen any service in the fleet, were taken to West Point Foundry and South Boston Foundry. The barrel was bored out to a diameter of 13.5 inches. A wrought iron sleeve with an 8-inch rifled bore was manufactured and inserted into the cast iron smoothbore. A threaded ring at the muzzle joined the wrought iron sleeve and the cast iron tube together. An optimistic article in Proceedings claimed that the conversion combined the best qualities of cast iron and wrought iron. A report by the chief of the Bureau of Ordnance credited the converted gun with 20% more power at the muzzle and twice as much at 1,000 yards than the smoothbore. While most ships in the active fleet received 1 or maybe 2 of these 8-inch rifles as heavy pivot guns, USS Trenton received the first 11 to be manufactured. 8 were mounted on the gun deck, with 4 on each broadside. 3 were carried as pivots on the spar deck, 1 at the stern and 2 at the bow. Only the rebuilt USS Lancaster would carry a similar battery. Whereas the 11-inch Dahlgren was fired with a hammer striking a primer, the 8-inch was fired using a friction primer, or in Trenton's case, it could also be fired by means of an electrical primer. An 1877 article in Proceedings describes an annunciator on Trenton's bridge, a brass fixture which looked similar to the compass binnacle. When a gun in the battery was ready to fire and the gun's captain connected a wire at his station to the primer, it completed a circuit and showed a telltale on the annunciator that the gun was ready to fire. An officer on the bridge could depress keys on the annunciator to fire the guns electrically. While the ability to fire a battery centrally in 1877 is fascinating, I have doubts of the practical utility of doing so at the time, maybe except at extremely close range. One of USS Trenton's guns survives at Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Trophy Park. We will take a closer look at that gun at the end of the video. USS Trenton was laid down in 1875. She was 253 feet long and 48 feet on the beam. Her hull was built out of live oak, heavily strapped with iron. She had a limited number of iron bulkheads, though in a wooden hull their effectiveness was questionable. Her hull form was modeled on USS Lancaster, a sister ship of USS Hartford. Following Trenton's completion, USS Lancaster received a major rebuilding, resulting in a ship almost, but not quite as capable as Trenton. Lancaster will be the subject of a future video. 8 boilers provided steam to a 3-cylinder compound engine which was designed to deliver 3,100 indicated horsepower to her 4-bladed propeller which was 19 feet in diameter. A trial conducted in October 1878 showed a maximum speed of about 14 knots with a mean speed of over 6 hours of 12.63 knots. Primarily a steamer, she carried a full sailing rig to extend her range and enable operations in distant waters in an era before the United States had any overseas bases. As her launching photo shows, she was equipped with a ram. Her bow was heavily timbered and capped with a cast bronze point. She mounted spar torpedoes, and her designers intended as many as 4 of her main battery guns to be able to fire directly forward. The idea of Trenton charging in to deliver a ramming attack complete with spar torpedoes and 4 heavy guns must have been attractive to her designers, who were aware that she was being built in a world full of iron-hulled armored ships. However, this emphasis on end-on attack came with some compromises. She initially mounted 2 pivot guns right forward on her spar deck. This put quite a bit of weight at the end of the ship, something not ideal in a wooden hull. The bigger issue was below. The gun deck was kept clear of the anchor chain and steam capstan which would have been there otherwise. This allowed for the bowsprit to be withdrawn into the space so as not to become fouled in a ramming attack, and for, in theory, the 2 forward broadside guns to be moved to the bow to fire through otherwise empty bridle ports. These bridle ports were at least 50 feet from the regular location of the broadside guns. Given that each mounting with carriage weighed something like 20,000 pounds, moving such mounts on the open gun deck of a rolling ship with nothing but tackle and muscle would have been neither easy nor convenient. Provision for mounting the gun deck guns forward required that Trenton's hawse pipes be a deck below on the berth deck. There the anchor chain and the steam capstan would not get in the way of the bowsprit or the guns. However, this meant that 4 large holes were open at the bow low in the ship. In 1878, Trenton's captain, J.L. Davis, observed that the hawse pipes provided welcome ventilation to the berth deck in ordinary conditions, but he was concerned that they would admit dangerous amounts of water if the ship ever had to anchor in a gale. He saw no reason that the pipes couldn't be moved to the gun deck. At the end of 1881, Trenton's then-captain, F.M. Ramsey, sent a list of recommended changes to Trenton for her upcoming refit. Among the recommendations was that the hawse pipes be moved up to the gun deck and that one of the forward pivot guns on the spar deck be removed from the ship, as there was too much weight forward. Then Captain Lewis Kimberly, head of a board of naval officers overseeing the refit, objected to moving the hawse pipes, and so the pipes stayed on the berth deck. USS Trenton commissioned in 1877. The ship was assigned to the European station, replacing Franklin as the flagship of Rear Admiral John L. Worden. Worden, of course, commanded Monitor in her battle against Virginia in March of 1862. Worden also commanded the Passaic-class monitor USS Montauk in actions against Fort McAllister and Fort Sumter in 1863. On August 5, 1877, USS Trenton was in a Turkish harbor monitoring the situation for American citizens during the Russo-Turkish War of that year. As Trenton left the harbor at dusk, the fort at the mouth of the harbor demanded that Trenton not leave. Trenton's chaplain, Henry Clark, later told of Worden's response. His decision was instant. He gave no order to put the ship about or come to anchor. He knew that he was proceeding at great risk. In addition to the danger from the fort, the channel was thickly planted with torpedoes. Presently, they came a shot across our bows. In distinct, low tones, but with the gravity of battle in them, the admiral said to the captain, "Beat to quarters, sir." Everyone sprang to his station. There was an instant silence. Then the order came, "Cast loose and provide." Each officer and man cleared the ship for action. A moment more and she was turned full broadside to the fort, her rifled guns frowning in deadly aim. On plowed the ship, the admiral's face with its scar of battle set like a flint with determination at any further demonstration from the fort, to give the order, "Fire!" But the Turkish guns were silent. Trenton served as the flagship of the European station for 4 years. In 1880, a correspondent for the Baltimore Sun who was traveling aboard Trenton wrote an enthusiastic report of all the stops the ship had made in the eastern Mediterranean. He described visiting the pyramids, the Acropolis at Athens, the site of Troy, and many other sites of interest to classical scholars. On the other hand, the annual reports of the Surgeon General of the Navy revealed that Trenton's crew enjoyed classical tastes as well, acquiring certain diseases ashore at a rate exceeding all other ships of the European station. Join the Navy, see the world. In 1881, Trenton returned to the United States for a refit. One of her spar deck guns was removed. She had electric lighting installed throughout the ship. In 1883, she was recommissioned and served on the Asiatic station as Flagship until 1886. She visited ports in China, Korea, and Japan before returning to the United States. In 1887, she was recommissioned and assigned to be Flagship of the Pacific station, making her way to the Pacific coast of South America around Cape Horn. As tensions with the German Empire over Samoa increased, Trenton, still considered to be one of the most powerful ships of the U.S. Navy, and indeed the most powerful in the Pacific, was ordered from Peru to Samoa. The story of the Samoan crisis and the Great Cyclone at Apia Harbor has been well described elsewhere. In particular, I'd recommend Drakenifeld's video on it. However, it's worth reading a bit of Admiral Kimberly's report to hear about what happened to Trenton. He wrote, "The ship had begun to make water during the early morning. The hand pumps were manned and all bilge pumps in the engine room put on. The water gained and threatened to put out the fires, the greater part of it seeming to come through the hawse pipes, which were situated on the berth deck. Every effort was made to stop the entrance of water at this point by jamming and bedding and by putting welding on the chains and veering into the hawse pipes. It could be checked in this way but not stopped, for the violence of the seas was so great as to force back everything that opposed it. All hands were set to bailing, and the handy-billy rigged, but by 9:30 a.m. the fires had been put out and the men driven up from the fire room. Work at the hand pumps and with the buckets continued from this time throughout the gale, with the hopes of being able to relight the fires and keep the ship afloat." Of course, Trenton would not be kept afloat. The pride of the U.S. Navy grounded on the beach. She suffered severe underwater damage and flooded up through the berth deck. Trenton was lost. Admiral Kimberly, it turns out, was a capable illustrator, and he produced a series of illustrations that showed the struggles of the squadron through the storm. In particular, to me, it's interesting to look at USS Trenton and the position of the hawse pipes and wonder, would it have made any difference had they been a deck higher? Later in the storm, a bridle port was forced open by the force of the water, and even more water poured into the ship. Maybe it wouldn't have made any difference, but maybe it would have. Trenton, on the other hand, didn't have the powerful engines of Calliope. Nevertheless, her crew fought the storm valiantly and helped rescue the sailors of other ships. Photos taken after the storm show the wrecked Trenton and the devastation wrought on the other ships in the harbor. The crew of Trenton was fortunate, losing a single man to the storm. The other ships' crews were not nearly as fortunate. It remained now to recover what could be recovered from the broken ships. Trenton's guns were hauled ashore. Photos taken showed the distinct rings on the muzzle faces of the 8-inch rifles. Those guns would be transported back to the United States. However, they'd never be used to float again. The era of muzzle-loading ordnance was over. Only one of Trenton's guns survives to present, but it was not at Samoa. U.S. Navy 8-inch rifle number 11 was removed in 1881 when one of the bow pivot positions was eliminated from the ship. In 1882, it was taken to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis and installed on the training ship USS Wyoming. A photo taken aboard USS Wyoming shows midshipmen drilling at the 8-inch rifle. The photo also shows an Erickson carriage that was almost certainly taken from USS Trenton as well. An 1886 article describing the practical instruction in gunnery that midshipmen received is notable because the 8-inch rifle, as well as other Civil War-era muzzle loaders, are the primary focus of instruction as late as 1886. The steel breech-loading rifles that would arm the cruisers Atlanta and Boston and Chicago, they're not available to midshipmen yet. They're still drilling on old Civil War-era guns hauled by ropes. It's remarkable how quickly our Navy's technology progressed. USS Trenton represents this midpoint between the ships that fought and won the American Civil War and the new Navy cruisers that would come into the fleet in the late 1880s. If you look at ships like USS Chicago and USS Newark, it's not too hard to see the legacy of USS Trenton, for indeed they were about the same size. But 10 years later, a steel hull, steel breech-loading rifles, the ships were far more capable, but completely recognizable to the sailors who had sailed on Trenton. Trenton was the pride of the fleet. It's a shame she was lost when she was. Even obsolescent, she was a beautiful, powerful ship. I'm glad that 8-inch rifle number 11 survives, providing a tangible connection to this famed ship and the sailors who served upon her.